Last week, as you know, we had Irish poet and essayist Dan Boland. And next week, Claire Hoffman, who's an editor at Rolling Stone, will be visiting Dana Goodyear's class, and you're all welcome to attend that. So Sarah is the author of 2 novels, Hempel Chronicles, which was a finalist for the 2009 Faulkner Award, and Madeleine Is Sleeping, which was a finalist for the 2004 National Book Award and winner of the Janet Heidinger Kafka Prize. And her fiction has appeared in many magazines and anthologies, including the Best American Short Stories 2004 and 2009. And she's received a Writers Award and an NEA Fellowship, and she directs the MFA program in creative writing at UCSD. She lives in Los Angeles and was recently named one of 20 under 40 fiction writers by the New Yorker. I'm just here to say a few words about her work, not to analyze her work, thank goodness, just to alert you to some of its effects on this reader. And Walter Benjamin says that every book has its ultimate reader, that it's written for and it's waiting for, and I kind of feel like I'm the ultimate reader, or the ideal reader for both of these books, which is really interesting because stylistically they're so different. They're very different, and yet they're startlingly similar. And that might sound like a contradiction, but contradiction is the lever to transcendence. So the first book is a novel in fragments, or short prose poems, and it's very much a book that exhibits a fairy tale's timelessness, and I think it was written from a fairy tale assignment. And after Sarah reads, she'll do a Q&A, and you can talk to her about the process, because I'm sure as she reads, questions will be brewing. So keep those questions in mind. So Madeleine Is Sleeping is the cover. When Nan picked it up, she said, "Oh, Lewis Carroll," and it is indeed a Lewis Carroll photograph on the cover. And it's a sort of baroque, ethereal fairy tale, but it's also kind of sensual and almost Rabelaisian, and just this real tour de force of beauty. It's almost like reading The Waves by Wolf, where you want to underline every single line. It's difficult to talk about the book because, to use a poetic term, it's ineffable. And at its baseline, it seems to me very much to be a book about the power of narrative. So Madeleine is asleep throughout the book, and at one point her mother says to her, "Do you remember the story I used to tell you about the donkey and the princess and how she found the golden key?" But Mother finds she can no longer recall the details exactly, nor the ending, nor the plot. "Well, there was a story," she says, "and what matters is that you liked it. And I told it to you. I told it to you countless times, for you could not be satisfied and would refuse to hear another story, or a story told by any other voice than mine. Do you remember that? Do you remember my voice? The sleeping girl was not so much as shuddered." And so at the baseline, it seems to me very much a book about how stories can save us. And her second book is a collection of stories, and I think you guys have read this before, right? This Hempel Chronicles. And it's been described as a novel, but it's written in short stories that we've read. I read in magazines over time, and then was so delighted to see them collected. And again, the central figure is a young woman, but she's also a dreamer, and the book, to my mind, is a marvel of structure, intertwined stories. And rather than Madeleine's castles and courtyards and gypsy circus life, we're in a middle school where Miss Hempel teaches 7th graders, and she has ambivalent feelings about teaching, as exemplified in this passage from the short story Europe, which I love so much. And I think you've all read this story, but Miss Hempel was sometimes astonished by the thoughts that she had while walking to work. One morning, she looked longingly at a patch of ice on the pavement and realized that if she were to fall, she'd fracture her leg in several places. Then she wouldn't have to go to school. And maybe if the doctors put her in traction, a substitute would be hired for the rest of the year. Perhaps she'd need a body cast. There was a way out. And it goes on. But she also loves teaching, and that's part of the paradox and beauty of the book. And so it's just a shard of her reflections. And it's almost impossible for her to continue teaching 7th grade because she's so empathetic. And this is familiar terrain for all of us who have
Brighde, and I'm so excited and honored to be here. Andy asked the excellent question of if you could have dinner with any writer, living or dead, who would you have dinner with? And I'm realizing I would want to have dinner with these writers. It was such a thrill to get to be with Nan and Judith and Brighde and now Janet. So you are incredibly lucky to have this faculty to work with, and I'm really honored to be here talking to you and reading from these two books that Brighde introduced so generously. So I thought I'd basically, on the menu, one of the items on the menu was tidbits. There were sides and tidbits, and we thought that was sort of a playful way of organizing one's food. So what I'm going to give you now, I think, is a sort of a tidbit from both of these books, just to give you a sense, for those of you who have read Miss Hempel, what Madeleine is like, and for those of you who have read Madeleine, to give you a sense and a taste of what Miss Hempel is like. And lastly, I would like to say happy birthday to Andy, fellow Aquarian. Brighde, what is your birthday? Saturday. Mine's on February 14th. And my husband is on Monday, so a gaggle of Aquarians. So I'm going to start from the beginning of Madeleine Is Sleeping. Hush. Hush, Mother says. Madeleine is sleeping. She is so beautiful when she sleeps. I do not want to wake her. The small sisters and brothers creep about the bed, their gestures of silence becoming magnified and languorous, fingers floating to pursed lips, tiptoes rising and descending as if weightless. Circling about her bed, their frantic activity slows. They are like tiny insects suspended in sap, kicking dreamily before they crystallize into amber. Together they inhale softly, and the room fills with one endless exhalation of breath. Madeleine Dreams. A grotesquely fat woman lives in the farthest corner of the village. Her name is Mathilde. When she walks to market, she must gather up her fat just as another woman gathers up her skirts, daintily pinching it between her fingers and hooking it over her wrists. Mathilde's fat moves about her gracefully, sighing and rustling with her every gesture. She walks as if enveloped by a dense storm cloud from which the real sylph-like Mathilde is waiting to emerge, blinding as a sunbeam. Madame Cochon. On market day, children linger in their doorways. They hide tight, bulging fists behind their backs and underneath their aprons. When Mathilde sweeps by, trailing her luxurious rolls of fat behind her, the children shower her. They fling bits of lard, the buttery residue scraped from inside a mother's churn, the gristle from Sunday dinner's lamb. The small fistfuls have grown warm and slippery from the children's kneading, and the air is rich with a comforting, slightly rancid smell. Madame Cochon, are you hungry? They whisper as she glides by. Mathilde thinks she hears curiosity in their voices. She smiles mildly as she continues on, dodging the dogs that have run out onto the street, snuffling at the scraps. It feels somehow like a parade. It feels like a celebration. Surprise. Once, as Mathilde made her way through the falling fat, she was startled by a peculiar but not unpleasant throb, which originated in her left shoulder but soon traveled clockwise to the 3 other corners of her broad back. She wondered if the children were now hurling soup bones, and made an effort to move more swiftly, but suddenly the joyous barrage slowed to a halt. The children stood absolutely still, lips parted, yellow butter dripping onto their shoes. They stared at her with a curiosity Mathilde did not recognize. Hearing a restless fluttering behind her, she twisted about and glimpsed the frayed edges of an iridescent wing. With great caution, she flexed her meaty shoulder blades, and to her delight, the wing flapped gaily in response. Mathilde had indeed fledged 2 pairs of flimsy wings, the lower pair folded sleekly about the base of her spine, serving as auxiliary to the grander ones above. Flight. Leaping clumsily, all 4 wings flapping, her fat like sandbags threatening to ground her, Mathilde greets the air with her arms spread wide open. A puff of wind lifts the hem of her skirts, seems to tickle her feet, and Mathilde demands, "Up, up, up!" With a groan, the wind harnesses Mathilde's impressive buttocks and dangles her above the cobblestones, above the hungry dogs, above the dirty children with fat melting in their fists. Stirring. Madeleine stirs in her sleep. Hush. When Madeleine sleeps, Mother says, the cows give double their milk. Pansies sprout up between the floorboards. Your father loves me, but I remain slender and childless. I can hear the tumult of pears and apples falling from the trees like rain. Smooth your sister's covers. Arrange her hair on the pillowcase. Be silent as saints. We do not wish to wake her. And I am embarrassed to confess, I think that's coming from my bag. Let me make sure everything is off. So that was the inelegant segue from one book to the other. So now I'm going to read from the opening of Miss Hempel Chronicles. This is a story called Talent. Many of Miss Hempel's students were performing in the show that evening, but to her own secret disappointment, she would not be appearing. All around her, she was confronted with reminders of the event. During morning assembly and announcement, pink flyers slapped crookedly onto the walls, a note from a parent. Please excuse Louisa. Rehearsals ran late. She will turn it in on Monday. Adelaide Burr cornered Miss Hempel during homeroom and described her costume. Adelaide was an avid appreciator of dance. Her first book report had celebrated in a collage the life and contributions of Martha Graham, and her second, a dramatic monologue, was based on a bestseller written by a ballerina who had suffered through several disastrous affairs and then developed a serious cocaine habit. Adelaide seemed excited by the lurid possibilities. Just imagine, she said to Miss Hempel, and clapped her hands rapturously against her thighs as though her shorts had caught on fire. The bodies of Miss Hempel's students often did that, fly off in strange directions, seemingly of their own accord. Now Adelaide told her that she had choreographed a solo piece to Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Balancing on a kitchen footstool, she had peeled the glow-in-the-dark stars off the ceiling above her bed. I have incorporated them into my dance, she said mysteriously. She made Miss Hempel promise that she would come. The building hummed throughout the day. Older girls came leaping down the stairs, fishnet stockings streaming behind them like pennants. Mr. Spiegelman, his yarmulke slightly askew, heaved the grand piano into the auditorium. From the bowels of the science wing, a trombone bleated out a solitary, echoing rendition of Luck Be a Lady. When Miss Hempel went into the bathroom, she saw pots of lip gloss perched along the edges of the sinks. The girls hadn't taken off their makeup since the run-through that morning, and all day their faces had squirmed self-consciously, their sticky black eyelashes batting, their shiny mouths twitching over their teeth. It was all new to them. Before the show, Miss Hempel groped around the bottom of her pocketbook and found a tube of lipstick she had left there long ago. The shade was a glamorous brown, and as she hid in the faculty lounge, crouching over her compact, she thought, narcissistic, and then corrected herself. Vain was more accurate, although not a vocabulary word. She rubbed a finger vigorously over her teeth. There were parents waiting outside the auditorium, herded together like hungry and disconsolate cattle. She would have to smile at them as she walked past. The program announced that Adelaide would be the first performer of the evening. Beneath her name was printed in italics, "I wish to thank my family and friends for believing in me." She entered the stage in darkness. The phosphorescent stars, sprinkled over the stomach of her pink leotard, glowed weakly, as if on the verge of dying. Apparently, most of the adhesive had remained on her bedroom ceiling, so Adelaide had secured the stars with Scotch tape, which caught the light from her parents' flash camera and made her glisten like an amphibian. She still had a little girl's pot belly. Her breasts were only nubs. A blue spotlight followed her nervously about the stage, lurching forward whenever it seemed as if she might leap into the air, which she did often, as well as collapse methodically several times onto the floor. Throughout, she kept her eyes fixed on some beautiful scene in the distance that only she could see. But the dance remained, in some fundamental way, incoherent. Miss Hempel hung onto the edge of her folding chair and tried to see Adelaide as lovely and silvery and ethereal, like a moonbeam or a nymph. She finally decided, Adelaide is lovely on the inside, and soon the rest of her will catch up. For she admired Adelaide, who could easily have been a pariah, with her walleye and her manic ways, but on most days she willed her eyeball into place and commandeered a sort of following. The next girls were, in fact, beautiful. The 3 ninth graders stood frozen on the stage in a staggered line, waiting for the tape to begin. They wore shiny athletic pants in shy pastel colors that swished when they started to move. On top, their little cotton camisoles showed the black straps of their bras. Miss Hempel worried about her own bra. All day it had refused to stay put, with one strap sliding down her shoulder at ill-timed moments. She suddenly felt what a relief it was to be sitting in the darkness. As a teacher, she felt herself the object of ferocious scrutiny. Kids missed nothing. They spent entire days looking at her. Miss Hempel was always getting chalk dust in her hair, or less frequently on the tips of her breasts when she would stretch up on her toes and write the homework assignment across the top of the blackboard. Some days it could be lovely, this attention, but it could be tiring as well, and she was glad for a moment to be there in the audience. The girls jerked about the stage in abrupt, perfectly coordinated movements, their faces stiff with concentration. Occasionally, a voice would call out from the audience, "Go, Jane!" and the girl would glance up and beam. The song was friendly and familiar. Miss Hempel slowly realized that it was about a man whose penis became erect while dancing with someone he really liked. He sang, "Girl, I know you felt it. Girl, you know I can't help it." And Miss Hempel felt herself go rigid with alarm. She was caught again in an awkward position, still young enough to decipher the lyrics, yet old enough to feel that a certain degree of outrage was required of her. If only she were truly adult, so that the words were unintelligible, the volume unbearable, then she couldn't be held responsible. The girl backup singer sighed, "Feel a little poke coming through on you." And Miss Hempel peeked at the rows of parents radiating out around her. They didn't seem to mind or even notice. Their faces were puckered, as they usually were during school performances, trying to see their children as she had tried, graceful, gifted, well-liked. If parents could understand the words, would they find the song acceptable? Miss Hempel was actively developing her sensitivity to the appropriate and inappropriate. She still had difficulty distinguishing between the two. Was it appropriate for her to laugh when a kid farted in class? Was it appropriate for her to wear clingy fabrics? Miss Hempel was not, she knew, a very good teacher. She made easy plays at popularity, dismissing class a few minutes early on Friday afternoons, beginning each year by reading the Philip Larkin poem about how your parents fuck you up, pretending not to hear when the kids did cruel and accurate impressions of her colleagues. She bribed them with miniature chocolate bars. She extracted compliments from them. She promised herself that she would decorate her classroom with photographs of great women writers, but she never did. The audience greeted the next performer with shrieks and whistles. It was Mr. Polidori, whom the yearbook had voted the sexiest teacher for 3 years in a row. This was especially impressive because he taught physics, which was generally considered an unsexy subject. But he wore large collars and shirts made out of synthetic materials. His glasses were small and quirky. He grew sideburns. And he also played guitar, a sleek black one, which he now settled into his lap. The shrieking continued. Mr. Polidori raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. He bent down to examine the tuning pegs. Miss Hempel did not think that she approved of him. Once, in the faculty lunchroom, he observed that Mr. Peel, their principal, resembled an enormous walking penis. Why become a teacher, she wondered, if you had difficulty with authority figures? Or maybe it occurred to her, that's why you did become a teacher. Mr. Polidori went out of his way to test the rules. He wore jeans and Converse sneakers, sauntered in late to faculty meetings. He freely confessed to having cheated a number of times when he was still in high school. Many of her colleagues, in fact, had cheated. Whenever the issue of ethics arose, someone would inevitably ask, well, we've all done it, haven't we? Copied a passage out of an encyclopedia? Borrowed an older brother's term paper? But no, Miss Hempel had not. Even as a second or third grader, she'd had a keen awareness of intellectual property. Her sense of herself as a thinker would never have allowed her to pass off someone else's work as her own. From her first days at school, she felt the importance of her mental endeavors. Her father was the one who had impressed upon her that intellectual labor is the most essential, the most valuable kind of work. That was what was so sad and difficult about teaching. Taking attendance, enforcing detention, making them love you, always seemed to come first. Often the period would end before any knowledge could be pursued. And as for her own commitment to intellectual inquiry, she was just too tired most of the time. Mr. Polidori, despite his inappropriateness, stayed until 6 or 7 at night, preparing labs and dreaming up new ways of demonstrating the laws of gravity and motion. By that hour, she was sitting in front of the television, numbly shuffling through her piles of pop quizzes. And besides, he was not wrong about Mr. Peel, his height, his probity, his crest of springy hair. Mr. Polidori played an introverted style of acoustic guitar with discordant tunings and dense flurries of finger-picking. Miss Hempel could feel the admiration in the audience radiating toward him, the girls' delight at discovering that Mr. Polidori was an accomplished and sensitive musician. And Miss Hempel admired him as well. He was up there on the stage, and she was sitting on a folding chair in the darkened auditorium. Dear Scylla Mitsui, who rubbed antibacterial gel on her hands at the beginning and end of every class, had asked her that morning, "Why aren't you performing, Miss Hempel?" Miss Hempel was copying a list of transitional adverbs onto the chalkboard. "Me?" she said. "Oh, I couldn't, Scylla. I no longer have any talents." And it was true. This time she wasn't casting about for compliments. That is what is marvelous about school, she realized. When you are in school, your talents are without number, and your promise is boundless. You ace a math test. You will one day work for NASA. The choir director asked you to sing a solo at the holiday concert. You are the next Mariah Carey. You score a goal, you win a poetry contest, you act in a play, and you are everything at once. Actor, astronomer, gymnast, star. But at a certain point, you begin to feel your talents dropping away, like feathers from a molting bird. Cello lessons conflict with soccer practice. There aren't enough spots on the debating team. Calculus remains elusive, until one day you realize that you cannot think of a single thing you are wonderful at. You have talents, Scylla Mitsui protested, and then paused. You are an affable teacher. Miss Hempel was moved, but knew that affable, although a vocabulary word, was not synonymous with good. She was not a good teacher, yet teaching had rendered her unfit for everything else. She was not a good friend, nor a good citizen. She had chosen teaching because it seemed to offer both tremendous opportunities for leisure and the satisfaction of doing something generous and worthwhile. Too late she realized her mistake. Teaching had invaded her like a mild but inexorable infection. Her students now inhabited her dreams, her privacy, her language. She found herself speaking as they did. Anything cheap or worn or disappointing was ghetto. "I'm so sick of this ghetto answering machine," she would exclaim to her empty apartment. Anything extreme was mad. "The food here is mad expensive," she would say, examining a menu. Her one comfort was the mutuality of the exchange, for they, without realizing it, had adopted her mannerisms as well. Once she overheard Michael Reggiani refer fondly to Julius Levy-Cohen as irredeemable. Or when Kia Brown was sent back to the end of the lunch line, she said, "I'm so cross." But really, victory was theirs. They had taken the castle and hung their flag from the turret. They had corrupted even her impeccable spelling. Miss Hempel, crowned grammar queen of her junior high, now found herself confusing their T-H-E-R-E and their T-H-E-I-R and inserting apostrophes where they did not belong. It was a war of attrition. Even the most egregious mistakes, seen over and over again, can begin to assume the appearance of correctness. Harriet Resnick now took the stage. Her cape wafted behind her as she guided her little card table into the spotlight. Harriet Resnick, precious artifact of another age. Her thick, swingy helmet of hair, the bangs that looked as if they had been cut with the help of a ruler. Her clanging lunchbox, her indifference to television, her adventure books, whose child heroes discovered buried treasure and tumbled down waterfalls and toppled tyrannical governments, her stories of Christmases in Canada, the giant footprints she left in the field with a pair of ancient snowshoes, her cousin Wilfred, with whom she made trouble and renovated a treehouse and took swimming lessons in a very cold lake, her guinea pigs, her magic tricks. She filled Miss Hempel with wonder. Harriet shrugged back the satin folds of her cape and plucked from the front pocket of her jeans a coin, which she held up for the audience to see. "Here before you now is a quarter, a regular, normal 25-cent quarter." Miss Hempel smiled. Harriet Resnick, exuberant soul, mischief maker, jumper up and down, did not like speaking in front of crowds. She kept her eyes fastened on the quarter. She spoke in the breathless, uninflected rush of small children reciting poetry. "Before your very eyes, I will make this quarter disappear." She waved the coin mechanically above her head as if spraying a room with insect repellent. "Disappear into thin air," she repeated, and gulped. Her wrist flicked. Her hand curled into itself. The cape shivered. Then, miraculously, the coin was gone. Blinking rapidly, Harriet held her palm out for the audience to examine. "Behold, no more quarter." She checked her hand as if she did not quite believe it herself, and for the first time she smiled. "No quarter." She patted the air with her outstretched palm, and the audience clapped. A claque of girls in the front row shrilled. "Now, Watch closely." And Harriet Resnick tightened her fingers into a tube, pressing them against her eye like a telescope. "Empty?" She presented the spy hole for the audience to peer through. "Nothing in there?" She righted her fist so that the telescope transformed back into her hand, gripping a fat bouquet of invisible flowers. With the unemployed hand, she dipped into the fist from which she extracted, in a single fluid gesture, a length of red silk. It floated in her fingers. "Magic," Harriet Resnick said. "I bet she's going to be gay when she grows up," Mimi Schwartz, the head of the art department, had once predicted. Mimi was gay, too, and Harriet certainly was different from all the other girls in the 7th grade. She was without fear, utterly uninterested in the opposite sex, never betrayed even the smallest flicker of self-consciousness. She fancied herself an incorrigible troublemaker. Miss Hempel went to great lengths to encourage her in this role. "Harriet Resnick, why do you plague me so?" she would exclaim, rolling her eyes up toward the heavens. Harriet liked to dart into Miss Hempel's office during recess and distract her from her grading. "Harriet Resnick, you are the bane of my existence," Miss Hempel would say, and Harriet would cackle delightedly. She had a battery of pranks, finger traps, squirt rings, fake rattlesnake eggs, all of which she practiced upon Miss Hempel. "Want some gum, Miss Hempel?" she'd coo, offering a piece encased in a suspiciously generic wrapper. Her teacher would reach out her hand, allow it to hover over the stick of gum, and then plant both fists on her hips. "Are you crazy? I know the way that mind of yours works." Miss Hempel would exhale as if she had just had a close call. "Harriet Resnick," she would say, eyes narrowing, "I wouldn't trust you as far as I could throw you." But she didn't like to think of Harriet Resnick being gay. Not because she had any misgivings about gayness, she just didn't like to think of Harriet becoming a grown-up. A selfish, terrible part of her didn't want to see any of her kids get bigger. Yes, she wanted to see Adelaide emerge from the wings as luminous as a moonbeam. She wanted to see Harriet Resnick make whole elephants disappear. But Miss Hempel couldn't bear to think of them not being exactly as they were now, as she knew them. She wanted them to stay in middle school forever. A volunteer now hoisted himself up onto the stage. He was a father, but one whom Miss Hempel didn't recognize. Tall and homely, he stooped down, as if longing to be the same compact size as Harriet Resnick, but she shot him a forbidding look and fanned the cards brusquely in his face. "Pick a card, any card," she commanded. The father danced his hand over the splayed cards Harriet held before him. "Do not, at any cost, show me the card you have chosen," she said. He extracted a card from the fan and held it to his chest. "Study your card. Memorize it." He did as she told him. "Once you are absolutely sure you have memorized the card, you may show it to the audience." The father shielded his eyes and slowly rotated his outstretched arm from one side of the auditorium to the other, displaying his selection. Parents, kids, teachers all leaned forward at once. A 6 of spades. Miss Hempel heard a little boy somewhere behind her whisper it to himself. "You may replace the card," Harriet Resnick said. Frowning deeply, she shuffled the deck, cut it, stirred the cards around on her little card table. Then, abruptly, she swept them into a pile and rapped them against the heel of her palm. After placing the deck in the center of her table, she waited. She seemed to count silently to 10. Now she was ready to continue. "Is this?" she asked, delicately tweezing a card off the top of the pile. "Your card?" With an uncharacteristic flourish, she snapped back her cape. The audience gasped. The father's mouth opened and closed. It was not his card. The card that Harriet Resnick held before her was not the 6 of spades. It was the 8 of diamonds. The father paused. Lie. Just lie. Miss Hempel willed him to do it. Lying won't kill you. But then, with terrible reluctance, he shook his head. Harriet Resnick looked stunned. She flipped over the card, stared at it. She peered closely at the father. Are you sure? She asked it very politely. Miss Hempel, sitting on her plastic chair, wanted to be someplace far away and to take Harriet Resnick cape trailing along with her. She folded her program into smaller and smaller squares. The father looked searchingly into the wings, as if hoping some benevolent figure off stage might come out and rescue him. Harriet, with painful concentration, returned the wrong card to the top of the pile. You can sit down now, she said. The father walked out to the edge of the stage and bent down so he could ease himself off. He seemed anxious to return to his seat, to the child waiting for him there. Hold on, Harriet Resnick shouted. The audience sat up. The man stopped mid-crouch. Wait, she cried. What's sticking out of your back pocket? The father straightened, bewildered, and turned to face her. As he did so, Miss Hempel saw that Harriet was right. There was something square and stiff protruding from his rear pocket. Is that one of my cards? Harriet asked. It was. The 6 of spades. The entire auditorium shuddered. Oh, God, the little boy said involuntarily. Oh, God! Oh, God! The applause was thunderous. Parents clutched at each other and hollered, utterly without embarrassment. Kids cupped their hands over their mouths and sounded long, keening cries. Up on stage, standing behind her card table, Harriet Resnick gleamed. Just wait till you see the next one, she shouted over the noise. Suddenly, there was a wild rustling. From beneath her little table, from inside a cardboard box punctured with holes, Harriet Resnick coaxed a bird. Not a dove or some other mild-mannered sort, but a glossy and muscular crow. It cawed loudly. It flapped its enormous wings. It tipped over its box, struggled out of Harriet's grip, and took flight. The audience inhaled, their heads craning as they followed its path around the auditorium, black wings beating the air. The crow swooped low. Boys reached up to catch a hold of it. Mrs. Willoughby took shelter beneath her program. Adults tucked the heads of small children under the crooks of their arms. Mr. Radovich barreled toward the emergency exit. Harriet Resnick stood on stage, mouth agape, marveling at what she had unleashed. Miss Hempel watched it glide toward her. Shiny feathers, hoarse call. And lifting up an arm, she stretched out her fingers. She touched it. Thank you. And I would love to talk now and hear your voices and hear your questions and comments and whatever's on your mind. I know this is the moment when the sort of awkward silence descends. But one of the things that I was told when I was first beginning to teach was the 7-second rule. Have you heard this rule? That when you ask a question, you need to be prepared to sit in silence for 7 seconds before you then either follow up with another question or answer your own question. But that, supposedly, if you really wait a full 7 seconds, someone will answer. Someone else will leap into the void to fill the silence. I've been writing, I'm one of those people who've been writing since I was a little kid. But mostly those were bad limericks. I started writing, I think, it more seriously when I was in college. And actually, the beginning of Madeleine Is Sleeping came, as Bridget was mentioning, came out of an assignment that I did for one of my writing classes when I was an undergrad. So I think that was, kind of in my early 20s was when I first started doing it more seriously. But both of these books took so long to write that they've been with me for a long time. And given how slender they are, I'm always sheepish to confess that it took nearly 10 years before I finished this first one. So, yeah. Thanks for the question.
I'm curious, and I'm sorry I don't know this for a fact because I'm not in the core class, but did you actually teach 7th grade?
Guilty as charged.
I did.
Was it private or public school, and what has been your reaction from teachers who have read your book?
I taught at a private school in Brooklyn right after I got out of college.
One of the things that's easier about starting to teach in a private school is you don't have to be credentialed. So I went into this first teaching job without having had any other classroom experience or having had, any education classes or. So I went in there really as a novice. And the response that the teachers have been really good to this book. I think that even though, one of the things I worried about while I was writing it, and it speaks directly to your first question, is, the fact that this is this little private school in this swanky neighborhood in Brooklyn, is this experience just way too particular? And I kept wondering, do I try to make this school somehow seem more universal or more recognizable? And I debated about this for a long time, and ultimately I decided to stick with what was the world that I knew best, because those were the details that I was most fluent in. And as a result, you have this kind of idiosyncratic school that's being portrayed in this book. But for me, I think it was a realization that sometimes you get closer to the universal through the particular rather than trying to aim for the universal. Because after the book came out, I got some really lovely emails from I got an email from a teacher in rural Wisconsin who had been teaching at the public high school there for 30 years. I got feedback from teachers at really different schools from the kind of school that I was working at. And I feel like there was something that resonated with them.
And I'm just curious, I'm a nonfiction major,
Yeah.
why did you decide to choose publish it as fiction and not nonfiction?
Because there's a lot that's made up in the book. And I didn't want to feel as if I had to stick just to the facts. And also I think because I wanted to protect myself a bit more and think about Miss Hempel not just as a self-portrait, but as a sort of composite portrait of not only my experiences, but those of a lot of other young, new teachers who I knew and who I worked with. So it was just cowardice, really. But it's interesting because there's definitely a tradition of the teaching memoir, but there isn't, I don't think, an equivalent tradition of the teacher novel. I mean, you have the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, I guess, and you have To Sir with Love. But in a sense, I feel like this in some ways has more in common with that memoir tradition. in terms of teacher experiences than it does with Muriel Sparks or some of the other great teacher novels.
Time so well in the Hempel Chronicles. Just the layers of memory and the present, past, future, everything. I was wondering, when you are in the process of writing, I personally, I sometimes get lost in where I'm going.
Yeah.
How do you handle writing so many layers and so textured experience? Future also.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's really hard for me to stay. It's really A, hard for me to be chronological, or B, to stay in one time frame. I tend to think associatively, and so my writing tends to be associative as well. So often, when I would be in the midst of telling one story, it would remind me of something else I wanted to say from Miss Hempel's past, or from one of her childhood memories, or so it was kind of one of the challenges in writing these stories for me was actually finding frameworks that would bring me back to the present. So like with that first story about talent, this was actually the second Miss Hempel story I'd written. The first Miss Hempel story got so well shredded in the workshop that I submitted it to and one of the problems was that I was moving around a lot, both in terms of point of view and in terms of time. I had sort of a traveling point of view, lots and lots of layers of time. And so when I started writing the talent show story, I was so relieved to kind of have hit upon the framework of a talent show because it both allowed me to digress and have something to come back to. So I tend to digress a lot. For me, one of the things I'm always looking for is some kind of a framework that can give some shape or structure to my associations and mental wanderings and moving back and forth through time. So that was something I actually had to consciously think a lot about like, okay, what's going to bring me back to the present? And in this case, it would be like, and the next act is. So that was sort of the artificial framework, but it was helpful in terms of grounding me and then giving me some more confidence as I went on to write the other stories. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Your process with the different stories. I know they were published individually, so did you kind of have all of this in mind when you started, or did you go as you went along, or what? How did you?
Every time I start something, I think it's going to be small, and then I can finish it in like a month. And I have to tell myself this every time. And when I wrote the first Miss Hempel stories, I really thought they were going to be one-offs, and that I was going to sort of exorcise all of my teaching angst, and then move on to other fictional territory. And what I discovered, and Miss Hempel also was written over the course of a decade, and what I began to discover is that I really think I was done, and then something would begin to start gnawing at me, some other unresolved issue left over from my teaching days. And I realized that, oh no, there's another Miss Hempel story. And this went on for the first 5 stories that were written maybe over 4 or 5 years. And then after writing 5 stories, then I admitted to myself, okay, maybe this isn't just a one-off. And then I began to think more about how all these would fit into a more holistic narrative. But it took getting up to 5 stories, actually at that point 6 stories. Not all of them made it into the book, but it took writing 6 Miss Hempel stories before I was ready to acknowledge that it wasn't going to be over so easily. Yeah, I know.
Was there a moment when you started to really cross some boundary and started to think of this as I'm curious, I wish it said it's not from happy collections or stories, but it's other charming novel, right?
I think that was the tipping point, was reaching those 6 stories and beginning to see that there were echoes that were happening among the stories, and then also beginning to see that there were holes and questions raised by those stories. And so then as I wrote the last 3, 4 stories, that was when I was really thinking about it as a novel, and how do I create threads that get pulled through all 8 stories, and how do I write a story that then addresses this question that gets raised but not answered in that story from 1998, So it became more of a process of trying to see where the gaps and the questions were, and trying to write into those gaps. Does that make sense? Like, for instance, the father is like a really strong presence in some of the earlier stories, and that just happened intuitively. And then it raises that question of, but there's a mom too, right? And so one of the later stories was a response to that absence. Yeah, hi, Sarah.
I remember when I finished Madeleine Is Sleeping, reading through the list of books that you sort of acknowledged as influences, and one of them was the story, I think it was called The Fifth House, about today. I was thinking first, basically, because that's the character in the book, but it's not a real thing. Where did you find it?
My father is a gastroenterologist, and I would have to spend, weekends sitting in his office when he would have to go in to do work. And there would be all of these very disturbing medical textbooks with pictures of stomach ulcers. And then there was this little slim book that was a biography of Le Pédomen that I think was published. It was published in the 1960s as a kind of novelty book, but it actually was a translation of an earlier French biography. In Madeleine, most of the characters in Madeleine are actually based on historical figures, and one of them is Joseph Pujol, who really did live in Paris at the end of the 19th century and really did have this incredible ability to fart on command. And so my father, to liven up his medical school lectures, he did a whole lecture about flatulence, and he used Le Pédomen to spice things up a bit for the medical students. And so I knew this book ever since I was a kid and was always fascinated by it. And he just seemed like a natural fit. He just seemed like one of those people who wanted to be in the world of that book. but you know, it was a real biography, and in fact, there's been a kind of like resurgence of interest in him. Ricky Jay, you know, who does these great compendiums of carnival and freak show performers, has written a good deal about Joseph Pujol. There was a documentary made about him. Apparently Johnny Depp really wants to play him. So it's interesting how interest in him, and my book did not spark this, but it was interesting to realize that, oh, there's a lot of other people who like farters too. So,
I was wondering about in the end of the book when they're not in the end, when people are in that she's broken off or engaged with her fiance, why you decided to reveal that through a conversation instead of showing the scene that they actually break up?
That's a great question.
two answers to that question. I'll first give you the really candid, just between us writers answer, which is that I don't write dramatic scenes very well. I don't think of dialogue as being one of my strengths. And so if at all possible, I try to kind of, you know how we are as writers, like you try to play to your strengths and try to create sleights of hand so that writers don't notice the things we can't do or don't do very well. And I didn't think I could write a breakup scene. And it just wasn't, and beyond that, beyond doubting my ability to write the breakup scene, I wasn't that interested in the breakup scene, because I feel as if when you do end a relationship, the moment where you actually have the conversation and say it's over is, in a sense, superfluous, because the relationship has been ending at much more critical moments than the actual conversation where you say, take back the ring. So I think I was more interested in kind of documenting some of those other moments when a relationship begins to rupture than I was in actually sort of faithfully capturing the split itself. Does that make sense?
I mean, I really like the way you did it.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that's, we were talking about this at dinner with Judith about how, when we were talking about biography, and how sometimes you can learn more. We were talking about biographies where you learn about the subject through an unexpected angle. For instance, whether it's the prism of learning about Raymond Chandler through the prism of his marriage, for instance. And so I'm always interested about that in fiction. It's just kind of finding a oblique angle or an unexpected angle through which to look at something that might otherwise seem familiar. Because, of course, one of the dangers of writing a breakup scene is the danger that it's going to feel over-familiar. So sometimes finding kind of an unexpected way to come at it is kind of the little dance around that technical challenge. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Can I talk a little from the club and add information for the simple father in the story, and I'm wondering if you get inspiration from your own father and someone else for that character.
Well, of course, my father, who is still alive, thought it was very Freudian that I killed off the father in the in the book. but I drew, I did draw a lot upon my own father in writing this, both in terms of sort of literal details, like my father's a doctor, my father likes to play tennis, my father had a very booming voice on the sidelines of soccer games. But I think I was also just drawing upon the feeling I have for him. And I think similarly, like with the students, even though some of the portraits of the students are fairly faithful portraits of real students, I think I think the thing that's most faithful is just the feeling that those students evoked in me, rather than the actual specifics of each. So yeah, I think I did. I think I did tap into that, I guess.
I thought this book and Madeleine Is Sleeping, they both kind of shape the whole notion of the novel. And I was wondering if that was something that people do intuitively, or if there are writers who kind of write these broken down novels. It really, kind of the way I read it, I felt free suddenly, like I too could write a novel, because it didn't have to be so, structured and break it into little sections.
That's a great question, and I was
Telling Andy earlier, especially when I was writing this first one, I wouldn't call it a novel. I just called it this thing I was working on, because a novel, just the term novel, comes freighted with so many very fixed expectations. And even when I finished the book, I wasn't even sure, can we call this a novel? I was very hesitant about what kind of term I could claim to describe it. But I was heartened by finding other examples. Penelope Fitzgerald's The Blue Flower, which is one of my favorite books, was one of those examples. Anne Carson, Autobiography of Red, that example really gave me heart, that she called that book a novel. Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities. So I kept looking to these other examples, and that sort of gave me the momentary courage to say, yeah, let's put novel on the cover. But I also think that, another really great book that for me was freeing in that way, Mrs. Bridge by Evan Cannell. Have you guys read this book? Oh, such a beautiful novel. So I think I was both liberated and shored up by finding examples of novels that didn't have this kind of John Gardner-like profluence and didn't have these 25-page long chapters, and but I was very hesitant about using that term, and then it's like the first time you do it, and then after that you're like, I'll call anything a novel. You feel really emboldened. But I was very, very unclear. I was very unsure about claiming that for this book. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. And did you research for Madeleine? Oh, Miss Hempel. I didn't do any research for it. Oh yeah, I did read a lot of the early settlers' journals, so that I could try to capture that Plymouth Plantation kind of voice. So I read Mort's Relation, and I read some of the early settlers' diaries. But beyond, I think that was the only real true piece of research I did. I'm not even with Madeleine. Even reading this little kind of novelty biography, that was sort of the extent of the research I did, because I find that when I do research, it actually, if I do too much of it, it sort of becomes like cornstarch, like a thickening agent, in not a good way. And in fact, when I first was writing about Monsieur Pujol and Madeleine Is Sleeping, there were these long passages that borrowed very heavily from his biography. How he got into a lawsuit with the Moulin Rouge, and then how he opened up a gingerbread stall. I mean, and all of these details that were so charming to me reading it in his biography, I was like, let's put him in. But it was really interesting because my teacher at the time, Stuart Dybeck, he observed that once I hit the Monsieur Pujol sections, that the energy in the narrative, like, dramatically dropped off. And that was the point when I realized that the research was beginning to sort of thicken and stagnate the narrative rather than helping it rise. So W.G. Sebald has this great quote that I love about how he does research as if he's inside a library that's on fire. So he just like grabs everything closest at hand and then gets out of there and just makes do with what he's snatched. And that approach is what's made the most sense for me, because when I have too much great source material, it ended up bogging down the fiction. And what am I working on now? I think I'm writing a haunted house story. I was writing a story, and I put it away for a while, and there was a house in the story, and then, one night in the middle of the night I woke up and I was like, wait, the house is haunted. And so suddenly now I want to go back to the story that had been sort of sitting on my hard drive, languishing there. And yeah, so I'm just working on stories right now. Because I never tell myself I'm working on a novel. Then things would dry up immediately. Well, again, I'm so, so grateful for the chance to be here. And thank you so much for reading the books and for your really, really thoughtful questions. So, thank you.